Hi, everyone. A very good afternoon to all and a warm welcome for joining us today. I am Vera from UOB SMU Asian Enterprise Institute, a unit within the Singapore Management University. So for those of you joining in from Bangkok, hello, hi, good afternoon. Okay, last year, the Institute had a wonderful collaboration with our partner, the Sustainability and Entrepreneurship Center, SEC, from Sassin School of Management, in sharing views and thoughts on sustainability issues for SMEs. So riding on that momentum, we are back once more with a new 4-part webinar series on sustainability for Asian family businesses. And the focus of this series is to really provide participants like yourself with practical insights into how Asian family businesses ensure sustainability in management, control, as well as operations of family businesses. Okay, so a very warm welcome to webinar 1. Let me move on to the next slide. All right. Okay, before we kick off the session proper, please kindly note the following. We are doing a recording of today's webinar, and here are some information which we would like to inform you with. Please do take a quick look. All right. If anything, please feel free to drop us a chat via the chat function, and we will be happy to assist. All right. Here is a quick view of the program lineup for today. Dr. Ang Tze King, Director of UOB SMU Asian Enterprise Institute, and Mr. Alex Mavro, Senior Advisor at SEC, Sustainability and Entrepreneurship Center at Sassin, will be doing a short welcome message to kickstart the session. Thereafter, we will invite today's keynote speaker, Ms. Melissa Moy, Head of Sustainable Business at United Overseas Bank, to share with us on the importance of sustainability for Asian family businesses. After Melissa's sharing, we will be inviting Mr. Chutney, Senior Executive Vice President of Central Group. I believe everyone is familiar with Central Group, the leading retail and services brand in Thailand, as well as Mr. Clarence Lee, the Chief Operating Officer of Lee In Group, Singapore's leading apparel manufacturer that exports globally to retail brands such as H&M and Gap. They will be in the fireside chat that will be moderated by Dr. Ang. And we will then end today's session with an invitation to all of you to post questions to our panelists. So please do join in then. So now, without further ado, let us kickstart today's session. And let's introduce and put our hands together to invite Ms. Melissa Moy from UOB United Overseas Bank to share more with us on the importance of sustainability for Asian family businesses. So Melissa, please.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ang and Alex, I note that there was some time for you to do some introductions.
Oh,
so
yes.
I'm happy to pass it over to you first before
Correct.
I start.
So sorry for
that. To say that. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you, Melissa.
Alex,
Sorry,
you wanna I'll give you the first right, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ong. I was hoping you would go first so I could just bounce off you, ping off you, because what I want to say is that most people on this call probably are much more familiar with you and your operation than they are with ours. I can say that we are the mirror image in many ways of AEI and your operation, or maybe, I don't know, who's the mirror image of whom? But we both have a very similar outlook towards it, a holistic approach to business and how business should be done. So I'm really happy to welcome everyone here for the beginning of this series of talks and look forward to this one and the remainder of them.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, this is Sir Kang. I am the Academic Director of the UOB SMU Asian Enterprise Institute since 2005. Been around for a while. I'm really delighted to partner Sassin in this 4-part series again. And it's Alex said, we actually are very like-minded. We actually embrace similar principles, and we are pretty much aligned in terms of what we want to do for our respective businesses in where we are based. Now, family businesses, the reason why we actually start this series, because family businesses are pretty much a substantial part of the Asian economies. In fact, for any economy in the world. And as a cornerstone of any economy, they really control and contribute significantly to any economy. So their well-being and sustainability is therefore then critical, right? Now, in this 4-part series, let me give you a quick sneak preview of what we're going to do. So this is the first kickoff. And as Bara mentioned, Melissa is going to help you to understand. She's going to share about the importance of sustainability to Asian family businesses. And in the second, third part, right, we'll be going into family constitution, family charter, how do you actually set up family boards, and how do you deal with succession. In the third seminar series, we're going to look at professionalization and talent retention, okay, as well as issues such as scalability and expansion. All right, so I hope you do join us for these webinars. Now, the last webinar is actually pulling everything together, right? We'll have a panel discussion with a panel that's going to come from Singapore and Thailand. And we will actually be able to then bring out all the key elements. That's going to be a nice summary, right, of the 4 webinar series that we will be having. Okay, right. So I hope you would join us in the next couple of seminars. Okay, now I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Melissa. Melissa is the head of Sustainable Business Corporate Sustainability Office. I think she has spent a lot of time in this business, and at UOB, her role supports the delivery of a sustainable business strategy across UOB's regional footprint, including management and mitigation of ESG risk, development of business sustainable business strategies and frameworks. Now, prior to joining UOB, she spent quite a number of years at Bank of America, where she led ESG efforts across Asia Pacific. She has also spent years in NGO sector, particularly in education and healthcare. All right. Now, this afternoon, as Bara mentioned, she's going to share with us, right, the importance of sustainability for Asian family businesses. Can we put our hands together to welcome Melissa? Melissa, please.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ang, and thank you to Sasan and to SMU for this opportunity to speak to everybody, and welcome on this rainy day in Singapore. Hopefully the weather's better for you in Bangkok. So I have the pleasure of, you have the pleasure of listening to me, or I have the pleasure of talking to you for the next 50 minutes on sustainability. And what I'm hoping to do is to give you just a background in terms of some of the trends and issues that you need to be thinking about as a family-owned business, some of the vocabulary that we use within the sustainability space so that you can sort of better understand and give context to some of the questions and queries that you might be getting from your stakeholders, and talk a little bit about, you know, how you can start thinking about implementing or embedding sustainability into your business strategy, and how to get onto the sustainability journey. This is, for me, hopefully a very interactive session, so I'm happy if you want to raise your hand and ask questions. It's a relatively small group, so happy to take any questions as we go along, or if you have any questions of clarification. So let me just share my screen. I can figure this out properly. So as Prof. Ang said, that what we'll talk about today is what are the sustainability issues that Asian family businesses are tackling. And the first and foremost, what we need to be thinking about is, you know, what is the global problem statement around sustainability? And one of the things with sustainability is it's really broad, and it covers a whole host of issues and a whole host of problems. And part of what we need to be thinking about when you're thinking about running an SME or thinking about running a business, and the materiality of sustainability, what you're doing, is to really narrow down and figure out exactly what is applicable to the work that you do, because it is easy to get caught up in a lot of the major social and environmental issues that are present. But what I want to talk about in this slide in particular, though, is that these impacts and these challenges are very real, number one, and number two, they're very large, and they are very material, particularly for those of us living and working in the ASEAN region. So what is the global problem statement around sustainability? Number one, we're looking at, under current trajectories, over 3 degrees of global warming if we look at the current policy scenario, which then unleashes catastrophic climate change related issues from a physical risk perspective. You're looking at close to 70% decline in animal population sizes since 1970. And when we talk about this idea of nature-based resilience, this is something that's really important because it is a clear signal that there are some major challenges from an environmental perspective that we need to manage and we need to mitigate. 30.7 million people were displaced by climate events in 2020. When you think about the impact that has on your supply chain, when you think about the impact that it has in terms of your businesses, in terms of, you know, the services and products you're able to provide, particularly if those individuals are in areas in which you operate or your business operate, it's very, very significant. And we're looking at an estimated 11 to 14% loss in global GDP by 2050 under the current climate trajectory. So really understanding again that climate change is about risk mitigation. It is not about tree hugging. It is not about rainbows and unicorns. It's not about doing what is nice and what is kind. It really is about managing and mitigating risk from a company perspective and from a country perspective. And last but not least, 10 million metric tons of plastic flowing into the ocean every year. And I think particularly about Thailand, where we know that there's some very strong petrochemicals related companies, as well as a very strong push for the circular economy and some really interesting technology that we're seeing in the Thai market at the moment. Basically, again, sustainability is mainstream and it has very commercial applications. And one of the things that we need to be thinking about when you're talking about and trying to understand sort of the materiality and impact of sustainability on a family business is reframing how you think about what it means to you and your business and your bottom line. So before I get into some of those big trends, I thought it would be important to talk about some of the language that is used from a sustainability perspective. We'll often hear this interchange between sustainability and the concept of ESG. ESG primarily is used in markets from a business analyst perspective, and it's environmental, social, and governance. And essentially, these are factors that are non-financial factors which have an impact on company performance. More and more investors, more and more stakeholders are looking at specific data points related to these ESG factors, and they will use them to determine, number one, the sustainability, the sort of ESG hygiene factor, whether or not they want to do business with you, invest in you or not, but also as sort of a marker to compare against peers on how companies are performing from an ESG perspective. So it is, as I mentioned, an extremely broad view. So from an environmental perspective, that covers anywhere from greenhouse gas emissions, which is likely the one that you hear about the most, energy efficiency, how you manage climate risk, how you manage water, how you manage waste, how you deal with emergency preparedness when you're thinking about flooding and or other natural disasters. From a social perspective, that looks at health and safety, the working conditions of your employees, the benefits you provide them, diversity and inclusion of your staff and of your board, human rights and human trafficking, and the impact you have on local communities, which is more of that traditional corporate social responsibility side, charities and volunteering. And then governance is really around ethical standards, board diversity and governance, how you engage with your stakeholders, what rights your stakeholders have, and how you compensate individuals within your company. So again, these are very broad factors. And what we're starting to see in the market especially is analysts actually taking bits and pieces of environmental, social, and governance metrics and trying to find correlations or causations between a company's ESG performance and their stock price. And you'll see some research out there that links, for example, board diversity with risk prediction and bankruptcy of the Fortune 500 companies that have gone bankrupt over the last number of years, and how one of the number one predicting factors was whether or not they had more than one woman on a board. So you're starting to see these cuts of information, and all this to say that ESG is a big buzzword. It is how we are talking about sustainability from a market's perspective, and it doesn't always only cover climate. The other piece that you should be cognizant of, and a vocabulary that we're hearing quite often when we talk about sustainability, is the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, these are 17 goals that have been set forth by the United Nations, where if we meet these goals by 2030, then we will have a just, equitable society that has addressed climate change, that has addressed social issues around education, around gender equality, and that is essentially sustainable. Why this is important is because what we're seeing more and more in the market from a commercial perspective is that companies are starting to use these 17 Sustainable Development Goals as a way to chart their contribution and impact from a sustainability perspective. So you're looking at some companies that choose to focus on 1 or 2 or 5 SDGs, and that's how they talk about their ESG impact, their sustainability impact. So what is most, again, material to the business that they use? And then what you can then is look at these SDGs, which all have sub-goals, which all have impact measurement metrics, and you can use it basically like a guideline and a framework from which you can talk about the work that you're doing and the impact that you're having from a sustainability perspective from your company. Other companies choose to report across all 17 SDGs and say that they have an impact or some sort of, contribution to each of these 17 SDGs and report in that factor as well. The bottom line is that more and more you're seeing these particular sustainable development goals be used in terms of company narratives, in terms of how they structure their commitment to sustainability. And it's a nice common language that you can think about using when you're speaking to your stakeholders about what you're trying to do. The other piece behind this is you'll also find dashboards from a country perspective. So we can find how Singapore is tracking, we can find how Thailand is tracking, how Malaysia, how Indonesia is tracking across the ASEAN countries. And oftentimes you'll also hear countries talk about what they are trying to focus on from an SDG perspective in terms of their policies, in terms of their investment in technology, or in their investment from an economic and business perspective. And those are all things to consider when you're thinking about integrating sustainability into your family business strategy, and how you're talking about what you may already be doing, but not framing it in the context of the SDGs or of ESG. So ESG has been a space that has been growing for a number of years. I've been in this space for 10 years, starting from a far more traditional CSR perspective and moving more into an ESG conversation from a financial services company. And I can tell you that 5 years ago, nobody wanted to talk to me about ESG. All they wanted to talk to me about was giving grants to community organizations and volunteering time. It really wasn't something, I would say, that really took off until probably 4 or 5 years ago, when all of a sudden you started to hear ESG. You started to hear about this concept of markets, and analysts really considering these factors. Climate change became a much bigger conversation after the Paris Agreement. And so we see these shifts and changes happening on an annual basis in terms of what the focus is on. And so S&P recently came out with a projection in terms of what are the key trends that you need to think about from an ESG or sustainability perspective in 2022. Now, you'll see here what's interesting about this Venn diagram is essentially there's an intersection across a lot of these areas. You don't necessarily only talk about environmental issues in isolation, net zero in isolation, or climate change in isolation, because there is an impact from a social perspective, there's an impact from a governance perspective. But what I would say about what we're seeing in 2022, 2 or 3 major factors that I'll cover in the coming slides. Number one is the concept of net zero and the declaration of net zero from a country perspective, but also from a company perspective, and what that means in terms of short, medium, and long-term planning. The second piece is then also about data and disclosure. So what are we actually talking to, and how are we communicating to the market in terms of what we are doing from an ESG perspective, what our actual impact is, and what changes and improvements that we're trying to make across the board. The third thing that I think is particularly relevant to SMEs and family-owned businesses is social issues in the supply chain. And so this is this concept that across the value chain, there was a responsibility to ensure that both social and an environmental perspective are covered. It's not a matter of closing one eye because it's not your direct business, it's somebody that you've purchased products or services from. Other things to note that I won't go into on this page that I think are also important is the concept of a just transition. And I may touch on this a bit later, but it's essentially looking at how do we ensure that we transition environmentally to a low carbon economy or zero carbon economy, understanding that there are emerging markets and that there are economic requirements that may mean that their transition cannot happen as quickly as you may see in developed markets. And then there's also this concept of skilling and understanding of ESG as a governance and leadership requirement. And so particularly for listed companies like UOB and others, where you have boards of directors and also some private companies that do, what is the skill level and the understanding of ESG related risk and opportunity? And how do you integrate that into a business strategy, a risk strategy, and overall operational strategy? So the big trend now, and I'm sure you've heard about it, and Singapore, those of you who are here know that the Singapore government recently did declare that we will be net zero at or around the mid-century, around 2050. So what is this concept of net zero? So achieving net zero globally means that we will reduce our carbon emissions to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. An increase of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050 means that we will see irreversible damage from a physical risk perspective. Extreme drought and severe weather, rising sea levels, loss of species and diversity. If you think back to the first slide that I presented, there are some pretty stark numbers already in terms of some of the challenges with displacement of human and human migrations, in terms of flooding damage, in terms of all of these challenges. It will get worse before it gets better. Those of you who are living in Bangkok, you may have seen some of the sea level rise projections, which sees 50% of Bangkok being flooded if we don't keep this 1.5 degree temperature rise under control. Those of you who may be in Jakarta know that the north of Jakarta is sinking and flooded on an annual basis, and those are challenges that can't necessarily be mitigated very easily. And so there's a lot of risk that comes with that. So if we don't keep our carbon emissions to net zero, we will then have massive issues from a physical risk perspective globally. Now, achieving net zero means that we need to have urgent adaptation and development of clean and energy efficient technology, meaning a shift to renewable energy, a shift to non-fossil fuels, so clean fuels, and the introduction and widespread adoption of new technologies, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, which you're likely hearing about a lot. Now, one of the challenges when we talk about net zero and we talk about these projections, and you'll see that many companies and many financial institutions are doing these sort of portfolio analysis of what actually happens to their portfolios from a financial institution perspective, at least emissions, as the companies, decarbonize or don't decarbonize, and whether or not they are net zero aligned. You're also seeing a net zero asset owners alliance, a net zero asset managers alliance, and many companies committing to being net zero. The other key piece that I think is important from a net zero perspective is to understand there's a difference between net zero and carbon neutrality. Net zero necessarily means that companies will consciously reduce the amount of emissions they put in the air versus just looking at purchasing carbon offsets in order to sort of net their contribution of carbon. And so one is the expectation. Offsets are meant to be used as a last mile resort for unabatable carbon emissions. But there is now an expectation from the market, from stakeholders, that companies will first and foremost be looking to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that they spew into the atmosphere. The second big trend is that credible ESG data disclosure is increasing in importance. So what this means is that the market is increasing in its sophistication and its requirement and its requests for companies to disclose their environmental, their social, and their governance related data, whether that be their greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 meaning your own emissions from your operations, scope 2 meaning your emissions from your electricity uses, and scope 3 meaning your upstream and downstream emissions. The amount of waste and water you use, the diversity numbers on your board. There is just a whole host of ESG data disclosure requirements and reporting frameworks that are out there. It can be confusing. It can be challenging and it can be difficult. And I think one of the big challenges, particularly for family businesses and SMEs, when you don't have a sustainability head or a sustainable business person, when you don't have the resources and the abilities in-house, how can you ensure that you are able to respond to MNCs who will be asking you for your greenhouse gas emissions, for example? And basically every single SME is some MNC scope 3 emissions. And so you will be getting these questions as they need to go to net zero. And how do you then also have your own baseline so that you can track and monitor your own progressions from a sustainability perspective? So it is a bit of a messy space. There are a lot of frameworks that are coming up, a lot of people in this space trying to help with the technology, trying to help with the reporting. What I can say is it's important to begin to understand what your plan will be, how you will measure these baselines, and how you will then disclose to your clients, your customers. And information and data is key, and it will continue to be key moving forward. The next trend, as I mentioned, is really looking at environmental and social risk management across the value chain. And this is something that I think has been around for quite some time, but we're starting to see, particularly from a social perspective, more and more hubbub around this from a reporting perspective. So this is the concept that you are not only responsible from your own environmental and social risk issues just from how you operate, but you're also responsible for everything upstream and downstream, particularly upstream when you're thinking about when you're engaging with suppliers, when you're engaging, you know, the classic example is from a palm oil company. If you are procuring palm oil from smallholder farmers, what are the environment and social risk policies and mitigations in place from your smallholder farmer so that you can ensure that the palm that you source has been ethically sourced, that there's no issues from a human rights perspective, that there's no issues from an environmental perspective. So gone are the days in which you can say, well, you know what? No, I'm responsible for this piece of the pie, but I received these from suppliers and I'm not responsible for the environmental and social risk related issues. In fact, from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, you're seeing a much bigger push for these scope 3 emissions. So those are the upstream and downstream, the use of or the construction of types of emissions, as well as really knowing and understanding your clients, your suppliers, and your customers, and making sure that when you are procuring items, that you are considering ESG in those decisions and whether or not you can actually incentivize suppliers to be able to be more ESG compliant. So these are the three trends that we're primarily seeing from an ESG, from a sustainability perspective, that I think are really important from an SME owner and from a family business owner. So what is happening so that all of this is, why are we even meeting today and why are we even talking about this? And what is some of the momentum that we're seeing around sustainability? So there's three major areas that we're seeing a lot of engagement from a stakeholder perspective. The first is from a government and a regulatory environment. Governments are rolling out sustainable development plans. You've got regulators focused on climate risk, which then boils down to then cost of capital changing when you're looking at companies who are in high carbon sectors or high climate risk related sectors and what that means from a financial institution's perspective. The second piece is that we're seeing a huge push from asset managers and asset owners who are really taking a hardened stance on sustainability. I would say a couple of years ago, it was okay for you just to say, we're committed to sustainability. Here's a sustainability report. We think it's important and we understand the need to manage and mitigate risk. But what we're seeing is this huge demand, a much greater demand for specific impact metrics, for short-term goals. For example, for a company to make a net zero commitment, it's not enough to say we will be net zero by 2050. The next level of detail in terms of midterm goals by 2030, in terms of trajectory, in terms of shift in strategy, those are something that is important and that stakeholders, the asset managers and asset owners perspective are really driving in terms of shareholder activism, in terms of investor relations engagement. And as I said, these investors have made these huge commitments to net zero emissions in portfolios. The last piece of the puzzle is that customers are increasingly demanding sustainability from their service and their product providers. Not just those from a supply chain perspective, but also your retail, your consumer customers, the millennials that are coming forward who've grown up knowing and understanding that climate change is a major defining issue in their lifetime, and will make purchasing decisions on the basis of a company's sustainability. So what we're seeing is that a couple of things, that environmental practices can actually help enhance long-term consumer branding. That 65% of global consumers actually want the companies they buy from to be eco-friendly. And that you're actually seeing that sustainability is so important that individuals would actually pay a premium for products that are sustainable and environmentally responsible. You'll see this much more for the younger generation, the Gen Zs, also the millennials, and some of the general population. So ESG is too big to ignore. Now, from a Singapore perspective, we actually just did a recent SME study in terms of sustainability, and we saw that 60% of SME clients actually saw that that sustainability was something extremely important to how they run their businesses, that it was a key business driver in the coming years, that they needed it to, number one, help improve and maintain their reputation, but also they needed it to play in the MNC field. So if they're going to be a supplier from an MNC perspective, this was something that's important to them. And from a family business perspective, those of you who may be first generation owners who may be thinking about the evolution and passing on to the next generation, chances are, if you're not getting hit from your clients and customers, you're likely getting hit from your kids asking you what you're doing. I can tell you that my own 8-year-old is already asking me about whether or not we're using renewable energy in our house and what we're doing to help climate change from a family perspective. So this is definitely something that is generationally important, that is very much top of mind. So when we look at SMEs and how they're looking at what is motivating them, why they are addressing sustainability topics, it really is continuing around this idea of how do we integrate this into our values? How do we tell this narrative to our stakeholders so that they understand why this is important? How do we ensure that we meet their expectations in terms of sustainability, be from a do no harm perspective all the way to a we are a green positive, we're a socially positive type of company? How do we retain our employees? How do we motivate them? When you look at hiring now, you're seeing increasingly new talent that comes in, fresh grads, really look and want to understand a company's commitment to ESG related factors. But then also there's this massive opportunity from a growth perspective. So how can we actually look at growing our business, taking advantage of green tech, taking advantage of an opportunity to be first in market, to be first mover, or to actually innovate new opportunities within our existing old business models to really respond to this massive shift from a fossil fuel-based economy into one that is renewable energy and non-fossil fuel based. It is a massive shift from a global economic perspective. And with that comes a huge opportunity. There is a stat out there that's saying that there's a $2.5 trillion annual investment that's needed globally in order for us to reach those sustainable development goals by 2030. And if we do that, if we're able to deploy and manage that capital in those particular regions, you actually unlock $12.5 billion worth of annual GDP, $12.5 trillion worth of annual GDP. Right. So the numbers are staggering. There is an economic opportunity that comes with it that we need to be thinking about as well. So from a practical perspective, how can you embed sustainability into your company strategy? So we can look at prioritizing and managing sustainability first and foremost, like other elements of your business. So work towards objectives, targets, KPIs, and evaluations. It cannot be a standalone tick the box type of an opportunity. It really needs to be something that you look across everything that you do from a business perspective and how sustainability can enhance, how you can manage risk related to it, and then how you can actually add value to your company. The second piece is to set up governance structures and committees to manage efforts to keep your strategy on track. So really embedding it into how you look at managing business risk and business decisions, having individuals on the ground who are responsible and charged with understanding how this will impact your business strategy and how to keep things on track on a regular basis. The third piece is then find out what sustainability elements matter most to your stakeholders. Don't try to do absolutely everything. Don't try to tackle all 17 SDGs. Be very focused in terms of what is material. How do you create value within what you are doing as a company, so that you're not having mission drift, you're not trying to do something that you're really focused on within the impact of the business that you're growing, what sustainability elements that you can actually add in. Then the next piece is to define what success is through measurable metrics. What's measured gets done. So commit to measuring them, commit publicly to measuring them, and then reporting them. Transparency is key. There's research out there that says that a company that is transparent about its ESG related metrics is, if they're positive, that's great. If you're negative, if they are bad ESG metrics, it's actually better for a company stock price to report on the negative things than to not disclose at all. So disclosure is key. And as soon as you can look at measuring and reporting in a way that's credible and in a way that makes sense for what you're doing from a company perspective, then that is something that will help you from a company valuation side. And the last thing is to think across your value chain. So think about your suppliers, think about your clients, and think about your employees, and how you can use sustainability as an opportunity to unlock value, to retain your employees, to build your company culture, and to build your brand. The last thing I'll say, and I sort of talked about this a little bit, and I know that for the most part you won't be listed companies, but what we're starting to see is that positive and strong ESG profiles actually are linked to enhanced long-term valuation. And in fact, when we looked at COVID-19 related issues, that ESG leaders actually outperformed during that time. You're looking at enhanced competitiveness, better risk management, lower systemic risk, higher profitability, lower cost of capital, higher valuation, and higher dividends is some of the trends that we're seeing across the board from a market side of things. And so ESG at the end of the day, again, is not the nice thing to do, but it is too big to ignore. And it's something that you can and should start thinking about from both the risk management perspective, but also an opportunity perspective as well. So I'm going to stop here because I have literally been talking for the last 40 minutes, 35 minutes. And pause and see if there's any questions from those of you on the call.
Thank you, Melissa. Anyone with any question, you can either type it on the chat box, or you can actually raise your hand and we can then enable your speaking. Anyone? Guess they're too shy. Okay, there's no question at the moment. Why don't we proceed to doing the panel discussion of our fireside chat? And Melissa, please join me on the panel. I have already introduced Melissa. Let me introduce you to the other two members of the panel. First is actually Kun Chanit. Kun Chanit is actually Senior Executive Vice President of the Central Group. Is actually a current visiting professor at Sassoon School of Management as well. He has over 30 years in finance, engineering, and management, and he teaches courses in managing growth and succession in family businesses. Kun Chanit is also on the board of a number of companies. Formerly, he served as Executive Vice President of the Stock Exchange of Thailand. And he's also appointed as independent director of a number of companies as well, including non-executive and chairman of the Risk Oversight Board at UOB Thailand. All right, so welcome, Prof. Chanit.
Thank you. Thank you.
The other distinguished panel is actually Mr. Clarence Lee, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Lien Group. Lien Group is headquartered in Singapore, as Very mentioned, is actually the supplier of to quite a number of big names such as H&M and the rest. And it's a leading apparel manufacturer that exports globally, right? And Lian also operates its own retail brand called Cold Wear. And people like us who travel to cold countries would know this brand pretty well. It's a good online presence as well as quite an extensive physical network stores around Singapore as well as Indonesia. Clarence joined the group in 2016 and is currently the Chief Operating Officer overseeing many areas of the business. And he has strong interest in technology that took him to a number of big names such as Adobe, Yahoo, and Visa. All right. So welcome, Clarence.
Thank you, Prof. Ang.
Hi. Okay. For the panel discussion, I'd like to kind of open up with a discussion where we left off in the last webinar series, and all of us kind of talked about how important sustainability is to the SME sector, right? Now, in your views, what are the issues in sustainability that are different for SME sector compared to those affecting Asian family businesses? So because there's this temptation that we kind of assume that an SME is necessarily a family business and vice versa. Who would like to kind of take this question?
Maybe, Prof. Ang, I can
Please.
have a quick comment first. Oh, okay, sure. I think it's firstly a question on scale and breadth. And with scale comes, I think, different practices and different issues. Looking at sustainability on a larger scale, it's actually quite a different exercise. In a smaller scale, management choke points, limited talent development are better tolerated. You kind of get away with it a bit better, right? But once you reach a certain size, certain critical thresholds, you can't, right? And at that level, those who are reliant on very immediate, very close owner oversight, you're gonna have I think quite a lot of fatal processes, right? So you kind of need to have different skill sets and mindsets in order to address those challenges. And sustainability is a huge challenge for the world, much less for a corporation. So I think, firstly, recognizing that addressing it as a family business is different. Also, you have different, I think, responsibilities. Like for ourselves, we're very cognizant of our business environmental and social impact, right? We produce consumer goods. We have a big associated carbon footprint. We also hire pretty big labor force in the local developing markets, and we also have an associated community footprint, right? So these things are responsibilities where we have to make sure that the impacts are primarily positive, and if there are negative ones, we mitigate those, right? So on our side, I mean, just looking at simply just the wages, for one, we pay higher than minimum wage, for sure, right? We try to move towards living wage. And then there are things on, having dialogues with local community, and then being a producer. And to some extent, our retail side too, we have to think about minimizing waste, right? Waste has a lot of associated footprint. And that's something that we've been pretty focused on. So scale comes into play, like I said. So between an SME and maybe against a family business, you have to look at it differently. And you know that you have the responsibility and skill to do it differently. Yeah, and we want to continue to move through that. So a bit of the opening comment there.
Thank you, Clarence. Thank you for that sharing.
Let me do it.
Yes,
I can go about. Let's start with the business itself. I think the entrepreneurship is the key. Survival of the business. Without the business, there's no family business anyway. Only after that, then you have a sustainability. If I were to use the group that I work with, the Central Group is a 73 years retailer. The sustainability does come in the past couple of years, but the family members understand the sustainability, whether it's the CSR, the ESG, as you name them. But at the end of the day, is they have to solve a problem, and leveraging on the retailing of what they have. So a few years ago, I was participating in one of our exercise by going out to do this farmers market. But the farmers market is not only just doing a retailing, but actually go back to the village and help them clean up the soil, make sure that it is tested, and encourage them to not using those fertilizer that is not supposed to be. And we actually co-brand with the villagers and sell them in our supermarket. And of course, the amount of money that they got is a lot more, but they also have to commit to not using those fertilizer. But at the same time, we solve a problem is the sustainability of the farmers. And then as things go by, we start having this farmers market all over our 80 malls around the countries. So we call them a Jingjai market. But it's truly becoming popular because of the organic nature. But at the end of the day, the family themselves understand they're solving the problem. And there are various problems within the other industry. But since we are the retailers, so we have, the plastic, paper, and all that stuff, that's, I call that's a gimmick. But it's not really solving the net zero issue, but is creating this sustainability within the villages and the farmer. And we pick villages around the countries and we promote various different agriculture products that they do.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet. Melissa.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I think I would add, and the caveat is I'm not a family business specialist and I don't own a family business. However, I imagine the concept of thinking about further than a leader or a board member sort of time in position. So this concept of thinking far longer term in terms of passing on from a generational wealth and a generational business perspective dovetails really nicely when you think about sustainability, because it requires a little bit more longer term planning and understanding the impact further down the line. And so there's a nice, opportunity there that integration of the conversation from a governance perspective also is probably facilitated than if you're dealing with a non-family owned business.
Sure. I think one way to distinguish it is looking at the modern day startup versus a traditional family business that has the kind of elements of the need for continuity, and sustainability in a different way as the ESG sustainability, I think. Okay, thank you. In fact, I visited the Central Group last week in Bangkok, and of course, Sasin brought us there. Very, very impressive.
Yes, the family members play a huge role in this, not the profession.
Yes. Okay, so let me kind of move on to the respective sort of areas, and I think I would like to kind of field a question to Melissa, in a sense that family business are synonymous generally with SME sector, as I mentioned earlier, right? Now, in fact, all large corporations today has been very successful, start off being SME at some early stage. I mean, even Yahoo or Adobe that Clarence worked for used to be an SME in the past. UOB is a really strong regional bank, and it serves a variety of customers, right? Ranging from very, very big ones to pretty small ones. And many of them are actually family businesses, right? Now, Melissa, do you think they actually face the same problem or different challenges, big and small companies?
I mean, the fundamental thesis and the fundamental challenge is the same across the board, right? We're trying to tackle same issues around climate change. We're trying to tackle the same issues around social related issues, whatever it may be. And it's fundamentally a shift and a change in how we do business. But I think, there's some pros to being a big MNC, as I mentioned, you have access to resources. You have, the ability to bring in sustainability specialists that can help implement and standards and measures. And then you likely are also operating within a context that is more highly regulated. And so the pressures from regulations, but also pressures from investors, means that necessarily you kind of have the kick of the butt, right? The fire that pushes change, and that stick approach actually helps implement sustainability much quicker than, say, if you don't have those same external pressures at the same rate. That being said, when you work in a big company, the sort of ability to be nimble, the ability to change, the ability to pivot based on technological requirements or implementing a sustainability strategy can be a little bit more onerous because you have different layers of individuals, of shareholders, of stakeholders that you need to get through in order to get that buy-in. From a small and SME business perspective, the challenges that we're hearing from our clients are, we want to be committed to sustainability. We understand that this is something that is a key business driver, but we don't necessarily have the resources. We don't have the knowledge and ability to implement what we need to in terms of this business driver, the business shift. We don't necessarily have access to financing that we would need, the CapEx that's required for us to invest in energy efficiency, for example. However, when a decision is made and can be made very quickly, then these changes and this transformation can happen very quickly and can be embedded very quickly in terms of a strategic perspective. So I think each has its pros and cons. I think what you're likely to see is bigger companies are further along in the journey just because they've been being pushed much faster and with much more pressure than we're seeing from an SME perspective.
Just let me add on something to just on what you said. From the point of view of family business, do you think it is sort of easier to implement something on sustainability or more difficult, given that the decision process, right, could be actually pretty fast or pretty quick? What do you think?
I think it depends. It depends on the personalities in the family business. If you have strong leadership or you have a strong next gen type of pressure who can clearly delineate what the business reasons for doing this are, then absolutely you can see that shift happen relatively quickly. And you do see it with some of these family-owned businesses in the region that have just made massive shifts and implemented programs very, very quickly and very, very swiftly. At the same time, though, if you have tension in terms of, and I don't think it's related solely to sustainability, but it could be any type of business decision, then those challenges and those interplays of dynamics might come into play. So I think the one thing though is as we make this mental shift from sustainability being this sort of championed idea of the tree hugger to one that's actually a business imperative, that's when you'll start to see those changes happening much quicker. And again, that's across the board.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Kun Chanit, you like to add on to this from your experiences with family businesses, right? Do they make, would it mean that having a family business would actually facilitate decisions on sustainability?
It's a difficult answer because same as Melissa, it all depends. I think for the smaller company that I deal with, that when I used to work for the Stock Exchange of Thailand, I was the president of the second board many years ago. And of course, for those companies who are going to go public, they start to pay interest in such issue because it's required by the governance and by the regulations. But if you look at them and they're not giving, they don't give a damn about this issue because survival is key to the business. So I think that is still the main. But again, once they get bigger and they get to the certain size, I think the understanding and the next generation is the ones who's going to be driving it. It's mainly the next generations who are driving this concept of sustainability towards the parents. So I see a lot of the next generations actually paying more interest. And again, if you look at the Stock Exchange of Thailand, where I used to work, the 600 billion or so US market cap, 70% of them is family business. And that's key. We are not a government-linked country. There are only 20 companies that are state-owned enterprise or government or GLC of sort. The rest of 500 companies are all SME and the big corporates. So those are the ones who are driving the economy. And those are the ones who are showing the others that you do need to pay attention to the ESG. And they are now taking more and more. You know, the first 10 years was more on this corporate governance, but those CG was done 10 years ago. Now the environment is taking the big chunk of the attentions that many of them is paying, because of course the original CSR of what we call in Thai of Thambun or donations is gone. Now that concept more or less is with regards to going to the temples, but those are long gone for many of the listed company. So these 500 plus companies are exactly showing example of what they need to pay attention on, whether it's environment, whether it's the poverty, whether it's solving certain environmental problems. So you can see those trends happening. But if I use the Stock Exchange of Thailand as a proxy, and it's not only the state-owned enterprise or the governments, it's the private sectors who are slowly driving it.
And also the next generation driving.
And the next generation is key. Okay. I teach my classes. I always get the questions from the students years ago of what kind of business model that my parent is doing, how can we engage more on the sustainabilities to put within, because the next generations find it that it is, maybe it is their champion to play, and the parents might listen to them, and because they are a listed company, they have an angle to participate within the company themselves.
Thank you so much. Clarence, you worked in a huge corporation, right? And you also now have the benefit of working with, family business, right? You want to say something?
Yeah. So maybe to put a context in this, I am the second generation for our family business. Yeah, we started in the 1970s. Yeah, and yeah, so I actually, I think for family businesses, and I mean, I've been asked this question before, and there's always the thing is that, do the second gen come in fresh or what, right? So I was pretty adamant. I took the or what, and I was pretty clear that I would never join fresh from school. I don't think there's a right or wrong here. I think it's a personal journey to make, and therefore my journey took me differently. From some of my other peers, I've heard they have come in straight. I mean, they have very deep knowledge of the industry, deep knowledge of the family business. So I joined 6 years ago, right? Not so short anymore. So before that, so to me, it was like with a view to joining as a second generation, I needed to see the world out there, right? So I went through the corporates and I picked up, I think, quite a bit of exposure that I then wanted to bring back, right, and see that applied to our business, to the group. I think that part has helped me, because I think only when you've seen it from the inside can you see what a huge successful MNC looks like, right, and try to pick the best bits, the bits that work, because you can't just immediately become an MNC. It doesn't work that way. Right, you have to bootstrap, you have to change certain things, talk to the first generation, even talk to other people within the second generation. And then next time, of course, think about the next generations to come, right? That whole conversation, that vision, that journey is not easy. Okay. So with that context, I think for us, just to address what you said earlier about being nimble, that there is definitely some truth to that. We definitely can do a lot of things faster, because I know what it is like to have all that review internally, stakeholder. I used to work through many stakeholders just to make certain policy changes, SOP changes. Here we do that. So therefore there must be a very strong, I think, vision from the top to drive that change. Because if not, it does get stuck. But once you have that, then the decision making to do certain things come faster. I mean, just to use one example, We went quite fast. 2016, we installed solar panels on one of our factory. I mean, that was not easy. I mean, I think maybe again, one more point to make. One of our key customer is H&M. H&M has a goal to reduce emissions by 56% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2040. And you can imagine really most of the pressure is passed down to their supply chain, right? Or passed up. And therefore we have already been under pressure on this point long ago. So as a business, apart from, like you said, I think what Kun Chanik talked about, the board, I mean, basically governance, right? From maybe on the stock exchange side, being a listed company, the customer drives a lot of that change for us, right? For us, the customer telling us that, hey, this is what it is. And we can read between the lines. If you don't do it, someone else will. And that's where the business goes. So we already had that journey for a while with a customer like H&M and other, because H&M has a very big focus on ESG long before ESG became as hot as it is today, right? So I think we saw that moving with the curve. So with that, we could do certain things like I said, coming up with using renewable energy. Although we did think that the capex is a bit problematic. So for smaller companies, right, whether is it family businesses like they are not availed resources like MNCs. There are now programs, right? Because ESG is such a hot topic now. There are actually programs. So for example, we now talk to a service provider whereby the solar whereby the energy is going to be on a leased basis. This isn't new. It's just that it's more accessible now. We talk to more people who are willing to provide such a model, right? Where it's more OPEX related and less CAPEX related, right? Because CAPEX is just tough sometimes for business, for family businesses to say, hey, let's put all this chunk back in, and it's painful. You kind of want to preserve some of that. Now we work more on that. So we will be able to lease this by having the whole rooftop availed to the service provider, and we purchase from them on a much lower rate compared to public utilities. That's still a win-win. Maybe you don't get as much ROI against a CAPEX investment, but it's somewhere. So I think businesses have more options now on the table.
Thank you, Clarence. You probably made a good choice by making your millions at MNC before you go back to your family business.
I don't think I did make millions. I think I earned millions in knowledge.
Wow. Okay. Before I move on to the next set of questions, there is actually a question posted by someone, I think it's Raphael, that goes like this. Where do you see financial benefits of following a sustainable approach in starting and running a business? Given that many studies found that an ESG focus decreased company valuation, share prices due to cost attributed to the to getting a quick profit and increasing spending to get to where you want to be, right, in terms of monitoring effort and measurability. So any one of you would like to take that question on having the financial evidence of a focus that can still pay good dividends? Because very often it sounds very good, right? But
I can do, but it has to be a very capitalistic point of view. Okay, so coming from the capital market and promoter of, first we have to promote corporate governance, and then the governance structures of many of the companies who want to go public. And once they go public, they have to maintain the governance structures, and we do have to penalize them if they don't. So that the good cop and bad cop role has been played, and we still do that in our capital market. But at the same time, we have to encourage not only the corporate governance practice, the ESG has to come in, whereby the valuations and the asset management companies will play along in creating those funds that would invest in the company's culture that promotes. So this is truly carrots and stick type of, and we started slow. And as times go by, there are other funds, especially in Singapore, in Malaysia, or from other parts of the world, who will pay attention to those ESG driven. But again, this is a very bad example because it just does not apply to all, but it does show that companies would pay more attention to it. And the regulators play even more role into this by forcing the companies that if you only play my game, you have to do it my way. So what happened is this year, this particular time of the year is we are going through the annual AGM of many of the publicly listed company. And this is the first year that the form, the submitted form that they have to give out to the investors has to be a combined form for the first time. It used to be the normal, annual report. Now this is not a normal. This is the first year they put in we call them a one report. A one report where it combines the normal financial annual report together with all the ESG driven check box and the tick box that everybody has to comply. And by doing that, it's basically exposing them whether the gap that they are not. So this is basically, taking them, taking their clothes off and taking them bare naked and see who does what by having them to fulfill. And this year is the first draft year. So next year, I think that's where they're going to really go through. But this is the first year. So if you go through Thailand, many of the big or small listed company, they're really having to answer those questions, whereby in the old days when you do annual report, they can really hide it and not mentioning it. But this is the year where everybody has to comply. And at the same time, hopefully that the fund asset management would have more clearer pictures of who doing what. And we do hope that eventually that the money will flow and the valuation will be given to those that practice the proper ESG. So again, bad example coming in from very capitalistic.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for that question is most of the research out there is on listed companies because that's where the data sits, right? So the research, that shows that ESG can generate alpha, that, companies that have stronger ESG scores have access to cheaper capital, that you can use it as ESG as a predictor of risk and company bankruptcy are really focused on those companies that are listed companies. So it's not really sort of a comparable type of a proxy. The one thing that I would say, though, that is interesting and from an SME perspective is that, number one, if you don't comply with ESG related requirements, then you will run the risk of not actually being able to do business with those large MNCs. So, Clarence, I'm sure, can speak volumes of, he talked about his relationship with H&M. If you don't lower your carbon emissions and they need to calculate your emissions into their scope 3 emissions and you can't show that change, then there will be another company, another competitor who will do so. And so not being able to implement those types of changes will have an adverse effect on your company's performance. The other thing I would say is to point out, here in Singapore, we have had this announcement from the government that the carbon tax will go from $4 to $5 a ton to $50 to $80 a ton by 2030. That is a very material change in terms of a cost of pollution for a company. And on the other side, flip side, something as simple as you look at the cost of electricity that's raised in the last couple, of months, what impact it has there. So, company valuations side, it's a bit more challenging from an SME perspective. We have more data from a listed company perspective, but I think just, looking at it just from a strategy side, not being able to respond to those big shifts from policy and from regulation will put you at a disadvantage.
But let me add to it that the carbon issue, when the oil price is above 100, is a very difficult exercise to do. Because many of the manufacturers, the boilers are, again, we can see the trend moving towards, again, those coal, whereby it is not what we want, but because of the cost benefit analysis, the last time the boilers have the half-life of 15 years of some sort. It's approaching that half-life, and this is the next cycle whereby the oil price again is high. So even though we are talking this, but yes, solar energy does do some subsidy, but it's still cost benefit analysis, and coal is coming back.
Or the other argument is that because oil price is going up, right, it makes some of these alternative energy panel or whatever more viable. It depends really how we argue it. But I do see your point about cheaper alternatives, especially in emerging markets. Okay. Clarence, anything to add on this point? On has it been remunerative for you to?
I think on the capital side, not so much. I think it's probably harder to see. For us, it's really still just addressing the business. ROI is really difficult conversation. Data also is scarce. I think like what Melissa said in our space. So I think we still need more learnings.
Yeah. Okay. Now there are two questions actually from Aaron. One is a very Singaporean question. Is there any government program aid or grant in Singapore in the ESG arena? How is TCFD related to ESG? So I'm not sure whether Clarence can answer that question.
Wow, grant side there are, but it's not an easy thing to do. And I think for someone like us, being a direct corporate that's supposed to do these things, I don't think it's the easiest conversation to have. It's probably easier to do with financial institutions, right? Because of scale, right? I think the ESG grants, also, sorry, I think when we talk about those kind, they also ask for a lot of justifications, right? And again, coming back to data, coming back to ROI, it's not easy to say a lot of those things. So we also are still struggling to get, I think, clear, direct financial support. Yeah, we are also afraid of the strings that bind, right? That comes with it. So we don't really know. So at this point in time, it is still very reactionary. I do hope that with the green plan and more things coming through, it can get better. But I mean, that's pretty new. And I think on the government side, we participated a little bit in a dialogue earlier, and we hope to see more coming out of that. So I think it's probably in a bit of an infancy to see where the support can take us in the future. Yeah. So right now, not the clearest.
Okay. Kun Chanit, Thai government, do they actually give a lot of grants to
they do a lot of promotions and subsidy in the past? Okay, and 10 years ago, they really pay attention to the renewable energy because, again, we have to distinguish between alternative energy and renewable energy. And because of the way we are thinking that sometimes alternative energies increase the price of the food that you take in sacrifice for the energy. So we are moving towards more on renewable energy. Of course, we can't touch the dam, the water, and that's too much environmental issue. So it falls into wind and the solar. Okay, so renewable energy in that sense was more or less what we have been doing in the past 10, 15 years. You don't see much ethanol in terms of the alternative because you have to sacrifice the food price and others. So those has been more or less, the policy has been more or less to promote the renewable, not alternative.
Thank you so much. Aaron has a question. I think I'm just going to answer that directly. It says about what are compliance. I guess the question really relates to customer requirements and what drives the motivation, right, to satisfy them. I think the end is actually that if you want to continue supplying to these guys, right, you need to then embrace or adopt what they want. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you to continue supplying to them. And increasingly, H&M is not the only one. A lot of big buyers, right, are actually very focused on this need to satisfy some of the basic requirements in ESG. All right. So hopefully that answers your question, Aaron. Right. Now, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to Kun Chanit and Clarence, just more on the family businesses side. Now, one of the reasons why we actually went to Sasin, or chose Sasin as an overseas partner for our EMBA, and that's also the reason why we spent a week in Thailand, or in Bangkok last week, was that the Thai businesses, right, maybe because of what you mentioned, there are many privately owned companies that are family businesses. And so when we look at the family businesses, right, we tend to think about Thai family business doing really well in terms of bringing it from one generation to the next. So it seems to be, Thai taking the lead in across the region. So what do you think, right, makes family businesses in Thailand focus on issues earlier than many Asian family businesses across Asia? And can you also share your experiences with the Central Group? You did allude to that earlier.
Maybe I'll go back history a bit. For the last 15, 20 years, my job was to take company public. So I have to see a lot of companies. I have to see a lot of families, whether in a different stage, whether they are the first generation, second or third. In the old days, many of the private companies have yet to decide to go public because of the corporate income tax. It's very high. So it's very difficult to go through the governance and the auditors and all that. But the click came in when one of our former president became the Minister of Finance, and he lowered the corporate income tax to 20%, whereby that's becoming competitive. And everybody now can figure out that by figuring out how much tax I can save versus the price earning ratio of 15, 20, or 30 times to my valuations, I think the cost benefit analysis become much greater. And especially in companies who are going through succession planning, whereby it's passing through between the first to third, second to third, and how do they keep it within the company, and they have to start thinking about their ownership design between generations. So those things click into one picture, and you can see that the last 10 years, many of the big corporate and big families, big or small, starting to go public. That's how it happens in Thailand. So it's many of the things that we have done. So when I see many of this, it's all about sustainabilities between generations as well. And they all keep it within the family, and the acknowledgement of you don't need to own 100% to run as a family business becomes much clearer to them as time goes by. So now they can be, 45 or 50. They don't need to even go 51. Some of them go 45%. And the wealth that they created and the wealth that was generated, it's enough to keep the company within the family itself. So, no need to use the Central Group, any other big family groups. It's all about how do they keep things within the family and grow the pie. Of course, they have to come in and grow the business because the family's members keep growing. Okay? Now, if I take Central Group, 73 years old company, the founder with 3 branches of the family, 16 children, few hundreds of the grandchildren and great grandchildren coming along, very, very, very active, and within the 3rd generations, 4th generations, they're all working, and the motto is to grow the pie. That's how they grow the business. Same as other families within that they went public over the last 10 years as well. I think it's in the Asian cultures, but whether they see it as going public as one way to sustain the whole next in line. So many companies took that route. And that's not necessary. There are other big families who behave as a corporate that are listed, but they are still private. But the governance structures of a publicly listed company is the one that help keep things coming along between generations.
Thank you very much for that answer. Clarence, do you think that, what do you think are the key challenges for family businesses in Singapore, particularly with respect to its continued existence, and how do you scale and grow a business? And can you share something on this with Lee Yin Group?
So Singapore family businesses are rarely focused on or in Singapore, right? I don't think that's gonna work. Because if you do so, you put immediate limits on growth and expansion that are quickly reached, right? So I think everyone realizes that along the way. We internationalized in the 1980s, right? We were selling to international customers pretty early, maybe because of the product type. And we started manufacturing plants overseas, right? In Malaysia first, then China, then Bangladesh, and Indonesia. So I think very quickly it was out of Singapore in order to grow and grow quick and become, where we are today. Retail also, we started retail much later, about 2000, and then we were in Indonesia in about a decade, right? So we realized that we always need to look outwards. You have to move fast to get out, because the limits within our little red dot are pretty, they're really there. At the same time, we also have our certain advantages, but I think we can talk about that in a bit. So that's a challenge, and we find that going overseas also then comes out with a different set of challenges, because you're immediately out of your comfort zone, right? You have to learn a new lay of the land wherever we went, and we went to a couple of places, right? Because there just isn't enough pastures in Singapore. And doing all that, it's a steep learning curve, but you kind of have to get past it to succeed. So knowing that we have to operate in a lot of different climates, different languages, all that probably built resilience in the first generation. And we have to keep that up. We have to keep going, talking to customers worldwide, and then we have customers in India. Even though, someone like H&M technically already exists worldwide, we still need to go to different customers to grow our base, right? It's always about growing, especially at scale. Because without scale, then you cannot answer and do a lot of the things that, for today's topic is, for example, ESG. You need scale to do that. If you don't, you really can't, right? So I think for us, that's a key challenge. And I guess in wondering, I think maybe it's a bit of a question that Aaron asked earlier. How do we then, together with the government, because I think we again have limited resources all around. Short of like what Kun Chan is saying, we can go public, we can talk to investors, but I think the whole ecosystem needs to be thriving to help Singapore family businesses succeed and continue to succeed moving forward.
Okay. Now, I guess kind of reminds me of what Kun Chanit said about growing the pie, right? Now, then your response to that is, we need to kind of grow the pie outside Singapore, right? Would that also then apply to businesses in Thailand? Thai is definitely a bigger market, much bigger market, 68 million population. Singapore, if you throw in all the foreigners, so you get maximum 5 million, right? So does it mean that the Thai businesses, just for my knowledge, right, always has to think about growing outside Thailand, or is Thailand just enough to grow the family businesses? Kun Chanit?
It depends. For our group is growing outside Europe and Vietnam. That's what we've been growing. But for other groups, it's diversify into other business. Again, you know that most of the entrepreneurial spirits that I deal with, they don't sit still. Okay, so they always find opportunities. And if they go by the capital market rules and regulations, they still have abilities to raise funds. So that's the pro and con of going public. But for them, whether they grow, they look at opportunity elsewhere. And before COVID, they were looking at the Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, and many of them go to Vietnam and Cambodia for the size, and at the same time for the easier to do. We did go Myanmar, but not as much. Singaporean does more, and so that is where we find comfort zone. Then only the bigger companies would dare to go Indonesia or or China. Okay, so for the smaller company, is the neighbor. Okay, we still don't have the Singaporean mindset. I mean, I am trained in Singapore, so I'm as Singaporean as you can be. You can see here from my accent. So, and the mentality is not the same. We don't have the entrepreneur and risk takers of going outside. So our comfort zone is still our neighbor.
Yeah. Thank you. We visited the minor group several years ago before the lockdown, and at that time they just recently just bought into the NH Hotel group, so diversifying into hotels in Europe, which I thought was quite interesting.
But very good you mentioned minor. Minor was actually one of the first field of our example when I was at the Stock Exchange of Thailand, that because of the big flood we have in Thailand years ago, they were the first one who actually diversified their business. Close to 40% was outside of Thailand. They are the first example of going abroad. This was after the big flood, which is about 10 years ago. Yep. So they had a very early start of going abroad.
Yes, and also quite interestingly, the second generation, John, is actually not the CEO. A CEO is a professional manager. We went to visit them, and they gave us a good briefing on the whole structure, which I thought was quite interesting. Okay, now those were back in the days where we visited and no one dared to take us because COVID was just starting. We had a lot of people cancel on us, but the minor group was actually very nice to continue to host us. Okay, another question from the audience. Raphael asks, are you aware of any ASEAN equivalent of tonic or 100% network, high net worth impact investment network, which is establishing a pool towards SDG adaptation, similar to either the access to targeted capital funds or potential partnership of MNCs? So if you look at the question he posed, right, he actually has a this link, right, to the website. Is that something you can answer, or is it something totally?
Sorry, Kunchanet?
I say no clue for me.
Okay.
I think impact investing in Asia is relatively nascent at the moment. I can tell you, for example, though, that our venture management fund at UOB actually has an Asia impact investing fund that ultra high net worth individuals can invest in, and it's looking at both social and environmental and financial returns as well. So it's a measurement across the board. There is an Asian venture philanthropy network that is, there's some philanthropy, but is also looking at, sort of using capital, using philanthropy to de-risk, looking at blended finance. So there's, I think, opportunities, but the actual networks themselves are not as well established. But you will have pockets of impact investing, individuals who are very keen on it, and then funds that are offered here and there. But it's not, I would say, as established as you'll see in other markets around the world.
Just for me, on my part, just to understand these 17 goals of the SDG from UN is too difficult to understand. So I gave up.
It's not simple. It definitely isn't simple. But I think what it allows is, particularly when you focus on one or two, it allows companies and individuals to really think in particular on what they can be looking at. And then when you dig deeper into the sub goals and you look deeper into the impact metrics, where you can actually focus to have impact versus, if you look at end poverty, you could say, well, by ending poverty, I'm going to go paint a bunch of schools. But you're actually not ending poverty. You need to be looking at deeper root causes and being able to measure them. But
I think just to give the audience a simple way to look at this. Whatever you're doing, whether it's a CSR, the ESG, or the SDG, whatever, just make sure you solve a bloody problem. Okay, just doing for this. Don't do it for the sake of doing it. Because I always question every companies I sit on the board, everyone that I come and trying to present, I listen to it and I say, what the hell are you solving a problem? If you're just doing it for the sake of doing, then go do charities. Then you give money away and just go sleep at night. And just like in the Thai, we go to temple and pray.
Well, this good advice, very good advice. I think that's very appropriate because you're right. Doing it for the sake of doing is not a good idea of true spirit of that ESG thing, I think. Right. Okay, I'd like to kind of wrap up this by going back to this whole idea of family businesses and SME family businesses making a very big impact on the various economies, whether it's Thailand, Indonesia, or Singapore. What in your view is going to stop these companies, right? These family businesses from doing well and continuing to contribute like they used to contribute to the economy, and we usually call them the engine for growth. Clarence, you want to start?
For us, I think is facing protectionism, especially because what we do is very tied to global trade, our supply chain, and actually our export. So protectionism, nationalism, or as some might say, reverse globalization is sort of threatening us a fair bit, right? Especially like I mentioned before, for Singapore businesses, we have to look out, right? The within is just too tough. And this insular behavior negates our competitive edge, right? So because if people don't want us there, so because for us, the pandemic has been a double-edged sword. It practically eliminated physical mobility, okay? Although, digital mobility and those who could do it then were able to succeed more, right? So these trends are scary, right? We have been actually highly reliant on global trade, right? Moving all these things to succeed. So if these trends starts to pick up too much and people look inwards, maybe looking at, large economies saying that, you know what, I'm self-sufficient, I'm going to care less about the outside. That's going to threaten our business and our business model a fair bit among time. So I guess that's something pretty much out of our control. We just kind of have to watch that and see how we could pivot and then maybe go to markets and then go in there deeper. But yeah, that is something that we see as a significant threat.
Okay, thank you. Melissa?
I think, bringing it back to sustainability and what we've been talking about today is that the assumption that companies can do this on their own, SMEs and family-owned businesses can do this on their own. So to set standards and set requirements without ecosystem support, without looking across the board at how we can encourage the development of skills, encourage the incentives, encourage, proper regulation, so that the foundations are set. And there's no arbitrage, that everybody's at a similar playing field and can actually grow together. That there is an entire support system that's needed from financial institutions, from governments, from players across the board. And if we just put a goal out there and not give that support that's needed for SMEs and for family businesses to grow, then we are in danger of not hitting the targets that we need to hit in order to manage changes required that are coming out of climate change.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay, Kumchanet.
I really have nothing to add because Clarence said it well. Protectionism, and trying to overdoing it just to satisfy somebody doesn't make sense as long as survival is still the key to this type of economy. So don't fall into this trap. Okay, at the end of the day, I still encourage that survival of the business. Of course, the ESG part, the sustainably will come in as part of you because you are the part of the supply chain. So you have to play that game. But for me, I think business come first and don't overdo it.
Right. Thank you so much. So we've come to the end of the panel discussion and in the end of this session, which is really the opening for our series on Asian family businesses. What we'll do is on the 30th of May, the second webinar will be on sustainability via constitution of family charter and family boards, and how do you kind of construct that. So the today's session was an eye opener for all of us. We learned a lot about scaling and size and threshold affecting your efforts on ESG, associated carbon footprints, as Clarence mentioned. That's really industry related. Being customer focused on things like your H&M and your customers demanding that you actually adopt some of these. Second generation driven, a lot of these ESG, as Khun Chanit mentioned, regulation, stock exchange, as well as regulators do drive some of it, right? But above all, I think we learned a fair bit about don't do it for the sake of doing. I think that's really the key point I'd like to leave all of you with. All right. So let me thank all our panelists for your time and your contribution. We've learned a lot. So thank you very much. Thank very much, Khun Chanit. Thanks, Clarence, and definitely thanks to Melissa. All right.
Thank you.
So let me thank all of you. We hope to keep in touch, and we'll continue to learn from all of you. Right. Now let me hand it over to Vera, who will then close the thing properly. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. All right. So once again, we have reached the end of our webinar, session 1. So before we end, we would like to invite you to do a short feedback for us, and your gift will surely help us bring about relevant topics that resonate well with your learning needs. So on behalf of Sustain SSC and UOB SMU AEI, thank you for joining us today. You have a wonderful and blessed week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.